My grandfather, a man who was once a soldier and a brilliant entrepreneur, passed away after a sudden illness. The funeral had just concluded when the entire family immediately plunged into matters of inheritance. I always thought he would leave a will, as for years he had told me, "Archer, the future of this company lies in your hands." But when the court released the inheritance documents, no will was submitted. The entire estate automatically fell to my father. Just a few days later, he kicked me out of the company and handed the executive position to my younger brother, a man who has never worked seriously a day in his life. I lost both the person I loved most and my career. But then on a rainy night, a stranger appeared. He handed me a sealed envelope, looked me straight in the eyes, and said only one thing: "You need to know the truth." Trembling, I opened the envelope, and what was inside left me stunned. "Hello, my name is Archer May. I'm 30 years old, living in Denver, Colorado, a city not as bustling as New York, but far from the tranquility of small towns. Denver has a certain balance, vibrant enough for me to feel the pulse of life, yet quiet enough for me to hear my own thoughts. But to be honest, my life has never truly been peaceful. Not because of this city, but because of my family. A long, complicated story filled with shadows and wounds that never fully heal. I grew up in what people might call a well-off family. Not the kind of ostentatious wealth with lavish mansions or supercars, but comfortable enough to never worry about food or clothing. My family owns a construction and real estate investment company, May & Sons, a name that sounds prestigious but hides a labyrinth of conflicts within. The man who laid the foundation for it all was my grandfather, Eugene May, a former soldier, a man I always respected, not just because he was my grandfather, but because he taught me nearly everything I know about life. My grandfather was an extraordinary man. Tall, with a deep, steady voice, his eyes always carried a warmth. As a child, I would sit by his side, listening to stories of his time in the military. He spoke of the harsh days on the battlefield, of iron discipline, of how a man must stand tall even when the world collapses around him. "Archer," he once said, gently patting my shoulder, "in life, honor is the only thing no one can take from you unless you give it up yourself." I carried those words with me like a small flame burning steadily in my heart, especially when everything became chaotic. After leaving the military, my grandfather built May & Sons from scratch. From a tiny office in the suburbs of Denver, he turned it into a reputable company in the construction industry. He worked with all his heart, not just for money, but because he believed every project was a legacy, a mark of honesty and responsibility. He always said, "A sturdy building must be constructed on a foundation of fairness." That was how he treated everyone, from employees to partners. He wasn't just an entrepreneur, he was a teacher, a guide. I was closer to my grandfather than anyone else in the family. My mother passed away when I was young, and my father, Harvey May, never really cared about being a father. My father was a cunning man, skilled at navigating the worlds of business and politics. He had connections people only whispered about behind closed doors, handshakes in the shadows, and polite smiles that concealed ulterior motives. To him, May & Sons wasn't my grandfather's legacy. It was a money-making machine. He loved extravagant parties, expensive watches, and the sense of power that came with sitting in the CEO's chair. But he wasn't the one truly running the company. He just wanted the profits and the prestige. Then there's Brandon, my younger brother. 4 years my junior. Sometimes I feel he's more immature than a child. He's a smaller version of our father, obsessed with glamour, craving attention, and always looking to be pampered. Brandon worked at the company, overseeing a small part of external marketing, but everyone knew it was a role in name only. He lacked ability, dedication, and the only thing he excelled at was flattering our father and boasting about things he didn't earn himself. I was different. Raised under my grandfather's guidance, I carried a part of him. His discipline, his integrity, and his belief that work isn't just about making money, but about building value. When I graduated college, my grandfather called me into his office. a simple room with an old wooden desk and a framed photo of him in his military uniform. "Archer," he said, "I want you to help me preserve this legacy. Not for the money, but for what we've built." That was the day I officially became the CEO of May & Sons at just 25 years old. I threw myself into the work like a man possessed. I wanted to prove I was worthy of my grandfather's trust. I learned to read technical blueprints, negotiate with contractors, and build relationships with clients. Some nights I slept at the office, papers piled high on my desk, cold coffee by my side. I once steered the company through tough deals, like the time we nearly lost a major contract with a real estate conglomerate because a competitor played dirty. I flew to Chicago, met the client face-to-face, and convinced them with my sincerity and a detailed plan I'd prepared over 3 sleepless days. We won that contract, and my grandfather, though already retired, came to the office to hug me. "I'm proud of you, Archer," he said. But life was never as simple as I hoped. Beneath the polished surface of the May family, cracks began to show. My father grew more distant, caring only about bank account numbers and powerful connections. Brandon sank deeper into a life of indulgence, spending recklessly and leaning on the family name. I tried to keep everything balanced, to protect my grandfather's legacy, but I didn't know a storm was coming. A storm that would destroy everything I held dear. Everything began to crumble on a gray October morning in Denver, with a light drizzle falling from the sky. I was in the office reviewing the progress of a major construction project when my phone rang. The trembling voice of my grandfather's housekeeper, Clara, came through the line. "Archer, come to the hospital right away. Mr. Eugene, he's not doing well." My heart seemed to stop. I dropped everything. Papers, laptop, still hot coffee, and rushed out of the office, driving like a madman through the slick streets. When I arrived at the hospital, my grandfather was lying there on the hospital bed, his face pale but still bearing the resolute expression of a soldier. He'd had a stroke, the doctor said, and there wasn't much time left. I held his hand, frail but still warm, and tried to hold back my tears. "Archer," he whispered, his voice weak but clear, "hold on to what I've taught you. Don't let them take it away." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand what he meant. Who were they? And what was it? All I knew in that moment was that I was losing the most important person in my life. My grandfather passed away that night at the age of 83. I sat by his bedside, listening as the machine slowly fell silent, feeling as though the world was collapsing beneath my feet. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because I didn't know what to do with the pain tearing through my chest. My grandfather wasn't just my mentor, my spiritual father. He was the flame that lit my path. Now that flame was gone, and I felt utterly lost. His funeral was held 3 days later, as grand and crowded as I'd expected. May & Sons was a well-known name in Denver, and my grandfather was a respected man. Businessmen from the real estate world, former soldiers who had fought alongside him, and longtime company employees all came to pay their respects. The funeral home was filled with flowers, pristine white wreaths mingled with formal condolences. I stood there in a black suit, trying to maintain a calm exterior, but inside I was a storm. Every handshake, every condolence felt like a quiet cut, reminding me that my grandfather was truly gone. My father, Harvey, appeared as impeccable as ever. Tailored suit, perfectly styled hair, and a flawless social smile. He shook hands, offered measured thanks, but I saw the coldness in his eyes. He wasn't grieving, not really. To him, the funeral was just an event to get through, an opportunity to solidify his standing in the business world. My younger brother, Brandon, was even worse. He arrived late, wearing an expensive but wrinkled suit, and spent most of the time in a corner scrolling through his phone, only looking up when someone important came to chat. I watched him, and for the first time I felt an unbridgeable distance between us. They don't understand, I thought. They don't understand what losing Grandpa really means. In the days following the funeral, I tried to return to work, but nothing felt the same. The May & Sons office, once my pride, now felt empty. Then came the day of the will's announcement, a week after the funeral. I didn't expect much, not because I didn't care, but because I believed my grandfather had everything planned out. He had told me more than once that I would take over May and Sons, not just because I was his grandson, but because he trusted me to uphold his values. "Archer," he'd said during a walk around a construction site, "I didn't build this company to be a money-making machine. I built it to be a legacy, and I want you to be the one to preserve it." I believed him, believed in that promise, and I thought his will would reflect it. We gathered at the lawyer's office, a cold room with dark wooden walls and the smell of old paper. My father sat at the head of the table, exuding confidence as if he already knew how things would unfold. Brandon sat beside him, fidgeting with an expensive fountain pen, his expression indifferent. I sat across from them, trying to stay calm despite my pounding heart. My grandfather's lawyer, Norman Pierce, a thin man with thick glasses and a dry voice, entered the room holding a stack of documents. He glanced around, his eyes briefly meeting mine, and I felt a sinking premonition. "Ladies and gentlemen," Norman began, his voice as flat as if reading a report, "I regret to inform you that Mr. Eugene May did not leave a will." The blood in my veins seemed to freeze. No will? That was impossible. My grandfather was meticulous, disciplined, a former soldier who never left anything to chance. I looked at my father, and the smirk on his lips sent a chill down my spine. Brandon looked up from his pen, his eyes gleaming as if he'd just won the lottery. "Without a will," Norman continued, "Mr. Eugene's entire estate will be distributed according to the law to his direct heir, his son, Mr. Harvey May." My father stood up, clapping his hands once as if concluding a successful meeting. "Thank you, Norman," he said, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction. "I'll ensure my father's legacy is managed properly." He turned to me, his smile barely concealing his triumph. "Archer, you've done well, but I think it's time this family took a new direction." I didn't respond. I couldn't. In my mind, my grandfather's words echoed, words about honor, legacy, and truth. But now they felt like a fading dream. I left the lawyer's office and stepped out into Denver's cold streets, feeling as though I'd lost not just my grandfather, but the entire world I'd built. The next day, my father called a shareholders' meeting at May & Sons. I attended, though I knew nothing good awaited me. In front of the entire board, he announced that he would take full control of the company. He spoke of a new vision, of necessary changes, but I knew it was all a performance. Then he turned to Brandon, placed a hand on his shoulder, and declared that Brandon would replace me as CEO. "He's the future of this family," my father said, his voice filled with pride. Brandon grinned, as if he'd just been crowned. And then, like a final stab, my father looked directly at me. "Archer, you've worked hard, but I think the company no longer needs you." The room fell silent. I felt everyone's eyes on me, a mix of pity and awkwardness. I wanted to protest, to say that I'd poured my sweat and heart into keeping May & Sons afloat through tough times, that this was my grandfather's company, not his. But I said nothing. I stood, left the meeting room, and walked out of the building I'd once called home. The rain kept falling, cold droplets pelting my face as I stepped out onto the streets of Denver. I didn't have an umbrella or a coat, just a suit now soaked through. I walked aimlessly through familiar streets that now felt foreign. Each step grew heavier, as if I were carrying the weight of a world that had just collapsed. May & Sons wasn't just my job, it was my dream, the promise I'd spent my youth fulfilling. And now, it had been stolen from me by my own father, a man I once thought, despite our distance, was still family. The days that followed passed in a haze. I returned to my small apartment, a place I'd rarely spent time in before because work always kept me busy. Now it felt like a cage, trapping me with inescapable thoughts. I lay on the sofa, staring at the ceiling, trying to find a reason to get up each morning. But all I felt was emptiness. My grandfather was gone. The company was lost, and family. The thing he always told me to cherish was now just a bitter joke. Money started running low. I wasn't one to spend recklessly, but my savings weren't enough to sustain me forever, especially without an income. I applied for jobs at other construction companies in Denver, but each time I received polite rejections. An old friend, now working for a large corporation, texted me, "Archer, I hate to say this, but there's a rumor that your father is bad-mouthing you to business partners. He's got a lot of influence, you know." Reading that message felt like a punch to the chest. My father hadn't just fired me. He was making sure I'd never recover. I started taking odd jobs to get by. I drove delivery trucks, cleaned construction sites, even worked as a server in a small bar on the outskirts of town. These jobs didn't match my skills or bring any pride, but they kept me afloat. Each day I woke up, put on worn-out work clothes, and told myself it was only temporary. One evening I was invited to a family gathering at my father's house. I decided to go, wanting to face my father and Brandon, if only to prove I was still standing. The gathering was held at my father's mansion on the outskirts of Denver, a place so lavish it made me feel out of place. Expensive paintings hung on the walls, chandeliers cast sparkling light over wine glasses, and the laughter of elite guests echoed through the room. I wore a simple dress shirt, the best thing left in my wardrobe, and walked in, feeling like an outsider in my own family's home. Brandon, as usual, was the center of attention. He stood in the middle of the crowd, boasting about a new marketing campaign he led for May and Sons, though I knew it was the work of the staff. The guests clapped, raised their glasses in a toast, and Brandon grinned as if he truly deserved it. My father stood beside him, patting his shoulder, his eyes brimming with pride. I stood in a corner holding a glass of water, trying to ignore the pitying glances from a few old acquaintances. Then Brandon spotted me. His smile turned sharp and cold. "Archer," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Didn't expect to see you here. I heard you're working on construction sites now? That's fitting." The room erupted in laughter, and I felt blood rush to my face. I wanted to fire back, to say that at least I earned my money through honest work, unlike him who just rode our father's coattails. But I stayed silent, gripping my glass tightly. My father approached, placing a hand on Brandon's shoulder, and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Don't mind him, Brandon. Your brother's just finding his way. You, on the other hand, are the future of this family. Everything, the company, this house, the yacht, will be yours one day." Those words were another knife, cutting deeper than when I was fired. I looked at my father, searching for any trace of familial warmth, but all I saw was cold arrogance. I left the party early without saying goodbye. On the drive home, I pulled over at a small park, sat on a wooden bench, and let memories of my grandfather flood back. I remembered the evenings he spent with me, talking about fair business practices, about how a man must stand tall no matter how harsh life becomes. "Justice and truth always find a way to return," he once said, and I wondered if that was true. In this moment, having lost everything, justice felt like an empty promise. But then, a few weeks later, a rumor began to spread. I heard it from an old friend who once worked at my grandfather's lawyer's office. "Archer," he said over the phone, his voice low as if afraid someone might overhear, "there's talk that Mr. Eugene did leave a will, but it disappeared." I sat up, my heart pounding. A will? If that was true, why did Norman Pierce say there wasn't one? And why would it disappear? I started replaying everything in my mind. My grandfather's words, my father's cold gaze, Brandon's triumphant smirk. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. I began sifting through memories of my grandfather, searching for any clue he might have left. He was a meticulous man. If he'd written a will, he would have ensured it was protected. I went to see Clara, the only person in the family I still trusted. She welcomed me at her small house on the outskirts of town, where she'd lived since retiring from working for my grandfather. She poured me a cup of tea, her hands trembling with age, and looked at me with worried eyes. "Archer," she said, "I don't know for sure, but Mr. Eugene once told me he had plans to leave something for you when he passed. He didn't trust Mr. Harvey, and he was worried things wouldn't go as he wanted." "Then where's the will?" I asked, my voice nearly desperate. "If Grandpa had a will, why did it disappear?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know. But Mr. Eugene was a smart man. If he wanted you to have something, he would have found a way to make sure it reached you." I left Clara's house with a faint glimmer of hope, but also a growing sense of unease. If there was a will and it had been hidden, who was behind it? My father, Norman Pierce, or both? I had no proof, no leads, only a gut feeling that the darkness enveloping my family ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. That night in Denver was colder than usual, the wind sweeping through the empty streets carrying the sharp chill of autumn. I drove back to my apartment, my mind in turmoil, trying to piece together fragments of memories about my grandfather, searching for any sign or hint he might have left behind. But the more I thought, the more I felt like I was lost in a maze with no way out. The days that followed passed like a shadow. I continued my delivery job, driving an old truck down dusty roads, hauling packages I didn't bother to notice. Each time I stopped at a construction site, I looked at the rising buildings and my heart ached. They reminded me of May and Sons, of the days I stood on job sites overseeing every concrete pillar, every blueprint filled with pride that I was carrying on my grandfather's legacy. But then, on a Friday evening, everything changed. I had just finished a shift, exhausted and drenched from a sudden rain while unloading deliveries. I pulled over at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, a place I often stopped at for a cheap cup of coffee, sitting and watching the flow of traffic. The shop was nearly empty, with only a few people scattered about, the dim yellow light casting shadows on the weathered walls. I huddled in a corner, sipping a lukewarm coffee, when the door opened and a man walked in. He looked to be in his early 60s, tall and lean, wearing a worn gray overcoat with frayed shoulders. His silver hair peeked out messily from under an old baseball cap, and his eyes were sharp and cold, as if they'd seen too much he'd rather forget. He glanced around the shop, then walked straight to my table without hesitation. A chill ran down my spine. Something about this man unnerved me. Not fear exactly, but a sense that he carried a secret I wasn't ready to face. "Archer May?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. I nodded, gripping my coffee cup tightly. "I'm Connor Marshall," he said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. "I was a friend of Eugene's from our military days." I blinked, trying to process this. My grandfather rarely spoke of his military friends, but I knew he had deep bonds with comrades he considered brothers. "You knew my grandfather?" I asked cautiously. Connor nodded, pulling a brown envelope carefully sealed with red wax from his coat pocket. He slid it across the table, his eyes never leaving mine. "Open it," he said, "but not here. At home, when you're alone. And be careful, Archer. There are people who don't want you to see what's inside." I stared at the envelope, my heart pounding. It was thin but felt heavy, as if it held a secret that could change everything. "Why are you giving me this?" I asked, lowering my voice. "And why now?" Connor sighed, his gaze drifting to the window as if checking for anyone watching. "Eugene was my brother," he said. "We went through the war together, and I owe him my life. Before he passed, he gave me a task. He said if anything happened to him, I was to find you and deliver this to you personally." A chill ran through me. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm. Connor leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Eugene didn't trust his lawyer, Norman Pierce. He thought his will might be tampered with. So he made a copy and entrusted it to me. But after he died, I was hunted. A group of thugs, hired men, came after me. They threatened my life, told me to destroy anything related to Eugene. I've been living in hiding, moving constantly, but I couldn't break my promise to him." My head spun. "Who's behind this?" I asked, though a part of me already suspected the answer. Connor looked me straight in the eyes. Your father. I don't have direct proof, but I know him. He has money, connections, and motive. Eugene told me Harvey never understood the true value of May and Sons. He feared Harvey would destroy everything, and he wanted you to be the one to protect that legacy. I gripped the envelope tightly, feeling it burn in my hands. Why didn't you come sooner? I asked, unable to hide my frustration. My grandfather's been gone for months. I've lost everything. Connor shook his head, his eyes filled with regret. I wanted to come earlier, Archer. But I was being watched. I had to be sure I wouldn't lead them to you. He stood, pulling his cap lower. Be careful, Archer. Contact me if you need me, he said again. The people behind this won't stop at threats. They'll do anything to protect their secrets. Then he disappeared out of the shop, leaving me with a slip of paper bearing a phone number and the envelope in my hands. I returned to my apartment, locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat at the kitchen table. It was late, with only the steady sound of rain outside the window. I opened the envelope, my heart pounding. Inside were 3 items: a copy of a will, a handwritten letter, and a small USB drive. I opened the will first. It was meticulously typed, bearing my grandfather's signature and a notary's seal. The contents were clear. My grandfather left all his shares in May and Sons to me, along with other assets, including his estate, a coastal mansion, and a yacht worth over $10 million. He included a note that I was to preserve the family legacy with honesty and honor. I read it over and over, tears welling up. My grandfather had kept his promise to me, even from beyond the grave. Next, I opened the handwritten letter. His writing was strong but slightly shaky, as if penned in his final days. Archer, it began. If you're reading this, things have gone wrong. I trust you, but I don't trust those around you. Hold on to what I've taught you and don't let them take what's yours. I've always been proud of you. I slumped over the table, tears falling onto the paper. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind, clear and warm, as if he were sitting beside me. Finally, I plugged the USB into my laptop. An audio file appeared. I pressed play, and my grandfather's voice filled the room, frail but resolute. Archer, if you're hearing this, I'm no longer here. I wrote a will, but I fear it won't reach you. Norman Pierce isn't trustworthy, and I'm afraid your father will do whatever it takes to seize May and Sons. I gave a copy to Connor Marshall, my old comrade. If something happens, find Connor. He'll help you. The recording ended, and I sat there, frozen, feeling as though the world had turned upside down. I didn't sleep that night. I paced the apartment, clutching the envelope. Connor's words echoed in my mind. My father, Harvey, was the mastermind. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were falling into place. My father's coldness at the funeral, his triumphant smirk when he fired me, the rumors that he was sabotaging me in the business world. But how could I prove it? The copy of the will, the letter, and the recording were all I had, but they weren't enough to confront my father and Norman Pierce, men with the money and power to twist the truth. I thought of Connor, of what he'd endured, living in hiding, hunted just to keep his promise to my grandfather. I felt a deep respect, but also fear. If my father was truly behind hiring thugs to silence Connor, what was I up against? I looked out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the rain. I couldn't imagine it, but I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. A darkness was lurking, and I had to be careful. One small mistake could cost me everything. I knew I couldn't act alone. The copy of the will, though signed and notarized, was just a piece of paper without legal recognition. My grandfather's letter and recording were valuable pieces of the puzzle, but they weren't enough to turn the tide. I needed someone who understood the law, someone who could help me turn these clues into a weapon. That's why I sought out Stephen Ellsworth, a lawyer specializing in wills and estates. He was a seasoned veteran in the legal world, and more importantly, he wasn't afraid to take on the powerful. I arranged to meet Stephen at his office in downtown Denver, a small but elegant building with glass walls overlooking the bustling streets. When I walked in, Stephen rose from behind his desk, shaking my hand with a firm grip and a sharp gaze. He was about 50 with salt and pepper hair, dressed in a navy suit. But what struck me was the confidence he exuded. Not the arrogance of my father, but the assurance of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "Sit down, Archer," he said, his voice low and clear. "You said you have something important. I'm listening." I placed the envelope on the table, pulling out the copy of the will, the handwritten letter, and the USB with the audio recording. I told him everything. My grandfather's death, Norman Pierce's claim that there was no will, my father firing me, and my meeting with Connor Marshall. Stephen listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or jotting down notes. When I finished, he picked up the copy of the will, reading each line carefully, then listened to the recording through earphones. He was silent for a long time, and I felt my heart pounding as if my entire future hinged on what he would say next. Finally, Stephen leaned back in his chair, removed his glasses, and looked at me. "Archer, I'll be straight with you," he said. "What you have here is significant, but it's not enough to win an estate case, especially against someone like your father who has money and connections. This copy of the will is valuable, but we need to prove the original was deliberately hidden or destroyed. The recording and letter are circumstantial evidence, but we need something more concrete. Like financial proof, for instance, that your father paid to bribe Norman Pierce or anyone else involved." I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "So what do I do next?" I asked. Stephen smiled, a reassuring yet determined smile. "We start investigating. You track down anyone who worked with Norman Pierce, especially those who might know about the original will. I'll handle the legal side and prepare a strategy. But Archer, you need to be careful. If your father is truly behind this, he won't let you dig around easily." I left Stephen's office feeling as if I'd glimpsed light at the end of the tunnel. Nothing was resolved yet, but at least I had a direction, an ally. I started by contacting a former employee at Norman Pierce's law office, a woman named Elena who had been his secretary for years. I knew her from visits to the office with my grandfather, and she had always been friendly, though reserved. I texted her, arranging to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, where few people passed by. Elena arrived late, looking nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being followed. "Archer," she said in a low voice, "I don't know if I should be talking to you. But because you're Eugene's grandson, I'll tell you the truth." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I saw the original will, Archer. It was kept in Mr. Pierce's safe. I didn't read the details, but I know it had Eugene's signature. Then one day after he passed, it disappeared. I asked Mr. Pierce about it, but he told me to stay out of it, that it wasn't my business." My blood boiled. "Are you sure, Elena?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, her eyes filled with fear. "I don't have proof, Archer. But I know Mr. Pierce isn't honest. And your father? He came to our office a few times before the will disappeared. I don't know what they talked about, but I saw them whispering in the meeting room, and Mr. Pierce looked very stressed." I thanked Elena, promising to keep our meeting confidential, and left with a new piece of the puzzle. The original will had existed, and it had been taken. But how could I prove it? I knew I was stepping into a dangerous game, and I needed to be more cautious than ever. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread. I heard that my father and Brandon were telling people I was trying to sue to steal the family fortune. The slander infuriated me, but I wasn't surprised. My father was always skilled at manipulating public perception, and Brandon, in his new role at the company, was likely enjoying playing the victim. I tried not to let it get to me. Then troubling signs emerged. One evening, as I left the bar after a shift, I noticed a man standing under a street lamp across from my apartment. He wore a black coat, his face hidden under a baseball cap, and he stood motionless. I pretended not to notice, but my heart raced. A few days later, I saw a black car parked near the construction site where I was delivering. The driver never leaving the vehicle, but I felt his eyes following me. I started checking my doors and windows every night, making sure they were locked tight, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I called Connor Marshall, the mysterious man who had given me the envelope. We arranged to meet at a small park early in the morning when fog still blanketed Denver. Connor appeared looking more exhausted than before, as if the months of living in hiding were wearing him down. "You're being followed, aren't you?" he asked as soon as he sat on the bench beside me. I nodded, recounting what had happened. Connor sighed, his eyes filled with worry. "Archer, I told you. Your father once hired people to take me out, and he won't hesitate to do it again. You're on the right track, but you need to be careful. Don't let them know you have the copy of the will." A chill ran through me. "I need proof. Stephen, my lawyer, says if I can find financial evidence, like my father paying Norman Pierce or the thugs, we could turn the case around." Connor nodded. "I don't have direct proof, but I know Harvey. He always leaves a trail, no matter how well he hides it. Find a good private investigator, someone who knows how to dig without being noticed." I followed Connor's advice. Through a contact, I reached out to Jack Sheridan, a private investigator who had worked on complex financial cases. Jack was a short man, but his eyes were sharp as knives and his manner exuded the confidence of someone who had seen too many dark corners of the world. I gave him all the information I had, including my suspicions about my father and Norman Pierce. "What do you want me to find?" Jack asked, sipping black coffee. "Financial transactions," I said. "Any large sums my father withdrew or transferred, especially around the time of my grandfather's death. If he paid to hide the will or hire thugs, I need to know." Jack nodded. "Give me a week. But Archer, if your father's behind this, you need to brace yourself. He won't let you win easily." A week later, Jack called me to a small diner on the outskirts of town. He was seated in a corner, a stack of documents in front of him. "I found what you need," he said, sliding the papers toward me. "Your father, Harvey May, withdrew 2 large sums from his personal account. One right after your grandfather's death and another 2 months later. Both were cash with no clear notes, but the amounts align with what someone might pay a corrupt lawyer or a group of hired thugs." I read through the documents, my heart pounding. The transactions were clear: $50,000 in October and $30,000 in December. No named recipients, but the timing and amounts made me almost certain they were tied to Norman Pierce and the men who hunted Connor. "Thank you, Jack," I said, my voice trembling. "This is what I needed." Jack looked at me, his expression grave. "Archer, you're playing a dangerous game. These transactions are just the start. If your father knows you're digging, you're in serious trouble. Get these to your lawyer and act fast." I returned to my apartment, clutching the documents like a ticking bomb. For the first time in months, I felt closer to the truth, but with that came a growing fear. If my father was willing to hire thugs to silence Connor, what would he do to me? I looked out the window and told myself I couldn't stop now, not when I'd come this far. One evening, after returning from a delivery shift, I discovered something that made my heart nearly stop. My old pickup truck, parked in an empty lot near my apartment, had been vandalized. The tires were slashed, the windshield shattered, and someone had carved a message into the hood with a knife. "Stop." I stood there, feeling as if the blood in my veins had frozen. This wasn't an accident or a prank by kids. This was a warning, and I knew where it came from. I called Jack immediately, my voice trembling as I recounted the incident. "Archer, you need to get out of your apartment for a while," Jack said over the phone, his tone grave. "The people who did this aren't playing around. I'll keep digging, but you need to be careful. Don't go out alone at night anymore." I nodded, though he couldn't see me, and hung up. A few days later, an anonymous envelope was slipped under my apartment door. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a scrawled handwritten note. "Be smart and leave town." No signature, no trace, but the message was as clear as daylight. My father, or someone working for him, wanted me gone. Not just to strip me of my grandfather's legacy, but to erase me entirely. I sat on the floor, the note in my hand, feeling a surge of anger mixed with fear. But I couldn't give up, not when I had evidence, not when I had hope. I started changing my routines. I avoided fixed routes, stopped going to my usual coffee shop, and constantly looked over my shoulder whenever I went out. But no matter how careful I was, I still felt invisible eyes watching me. Then one evening, as I sat in my apartment clutching a cold coffee and staring at the stack of documents, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Meet me. 10 p.m. Rusty Nail Bar. It's about Harvey May. I read it over and over, my heart pounding. This could be a trap. Connor had warned me about the people working for my father, and I knew they wouldn't hesitate to lure me into a dark corner. But what if it was real? What if someone had more clues? I couldn't pass up the chance, no matter how dangerous. I arrived at Rusty Nail, a small bar on the outskirts of town where the dim lighting and stale beer smell clung to the walls. I chose a secluded corner near the emergency exit just in case I needed to run. The clock read 9:55 and I sat there, gripping my phone, my eyes fixed on the door. At exactly 10 o'clock, a figure walked in wearing a hoodie pulled low, obscuring most of their face. I tightened my grip, ready to bolt, but then the person pulled back the hood and I froze. It was Brandon, my younger brother. Brandon looked different. Gone were the arrogant smirk and smug eyes. His eyes were red, his hair disheveled, and his hands trembled as he sat across from me. "Archer," he said, his voice hoarse, "I need to talk to you." I stared at him, every sense on high alert. "What's this about, Brandon?" I asked, my voice cold. "Did Dad send you to set me up?" Brandon shook his head, his eyes glinting with a fear I'd never seen before. "No, Archer, I swear. I'm here because I can't keep doing this." He pulled a stack of papers from his jacket and slid them toward me. "Look at these." I took the papers, my heart racing. They were printed emails, exchanges between my father and Norman Pierce. I skimmed them, and each line felt like a knife. Phrases like payment, handle it permanently, and make sure no one finds out danced before my eyes. One email from my father read, "Ensure the kid never gets a chance. I'll take care of the rest." My blood ran cold. The kid, that was me. "Brandon," I said, my voice shaking, "where did you get these?" Brandon lowered his head, his hands clasped tightly. "I got them from Dad's computer," he said. "I know you won't believe me, but I don't want this to go any further. I overheard Dad talking to Pierce about taking you out if you don't stay quiet. I don't want you dead, Archer. I wanted the money, the attention from Dad, but not like this." I studied him, searching for any hint of deception in his eyes. Brandon had mocked me, sided with our father, laughed at me in front of a crowd. How could I trust him now? But his voice trembled, and in that moment I saw a different Brandon. Not the arrogant jerk from the family party, but a scared younger brother caught in his own mistakes. "Why, Brandon?" I asked, my voice softening. "Why help me now after everything you've done?" Brandon looked up, his eyes glistening with tears. "Because I was wrong. I thought Dad was doing this for the family, but he only cares about money and power. I don't want to lose you. I know I've been a jerk, but I want to make it right. Let me help you, please. Just forgive me." I didn't answer right away. I held the emails, reading them again, and realized they aligned perfectly with Jack's report about the cash withdrawals. The $50,000 right after my grandfather's death, likely to pay Pierce to hide the will. The $30,000 later, possibly to hire the thugs who hunted Connor. It all fit together terrifyingly well, and I knew whether I wanted to or not, I needed Brandon. "All right," I said, my voice dry. "But if this is a trap, Brandon, I swear I won't forgive you." Brandon nodded, looking relieved but still anxious. "I'll keep watching Dad," he said. If I find more evidence, I'll get it to you. But you have to be careful. Dad knows you're investigating and he won't stop." We left the bar separately, me first, Brandon a few minutes later. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Was Brandon sincere? Or was this another of my father's games? I wasn't sure, but I knew I had no choice. Brandon might have betrayed me before, but now he could be the only one to help me uncover the truth. The next morning, I met Stephen Ellsworth at his office, bringing everything I had: the copy of the will, my grandfather's handwritten letter, the USB with the audio recording, Jack's financial report, and the emails from Brandon. Stephen examined each document, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Archer," he said, closing the file, "this is enough for us to file a petition with the probate court. We'll request to reopen the inheritance case on the grounds of suspected fraud. But you need to understand this will be a fierce battle. Your father and Norman Pierce won't take this lying down." I nodded, feeling a mix of determination and anxiety. "I'm ready," I said, though a part of me still trembled. "As long as we can reclaim what belongs to my grandfather, I'll do whatever it takes." Stephen smiled, a confident smile. "Good. I'll prepare the lawsuit and file it with the court today. Brace yourself, Archer. Your father has a lot of influence, and he'll pull every trick in the book to bring you down." Just as Stephen predicted, the response from my father and Norman Pierce came like a storm. Mere hours after the lawsuit was filed, I received a call from my father. His voice over the phone was icy, but I could sense the anger simmering beneath his words. "Archer, what do you think you're doing?" he said. "You dare sue your own family, making up stories to ruin my reputation? You'll regret this." I didn't respond, just hung up, my heart pounding. Norman Pierce also spoke out, issuing a statement to a local newspaper claiming I was an ungrateful son trying to fabricate lies to steal the family fortune. The rumors spread quickly, and I felt the scrutinizing gazes from old acquaintances, neighbors, and even former colleagues at May & Sons. But I didn't care. I had lost too much to fear whispers anymore. The day of the first court hearing arrived, and I walked into the Denver probate courtroom feeling like I was stepping onto a battlefield. The room was cold, with dark wooden walls and a tense atmosphere. My father sat on the other side, dressed in an expensive suit, his face expressionless. Beside him was Norman Pierce, looking calm, but I noticed his hands gripping each other tightly as if trying to hide his nervousness. Brandon wasn't there, and I wondered if he was truly on my side as he had promised. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern gaze, asked Stephen to present our case. Stephen stood, his voice resonating with strength and clarity. He argued that there was evidence suggesting my grandfather Eugene May's original will had been deliberately hidden or destroyed, and we requested the court to reopen the inheritance case. He submitted the documents: the copy of the will, the handwritten letter, the audio recording, Elena's testimony, the former employee of Norman Pierce, and the emails from Brandon. Each piece was presented like an arrow aimed directly at my father and Pierce. When it was Norman Pierce's turn, he stood, adjusting his glasses and speaking in an unnervingly calm tone. "Your Honor, I must assert that I never received any will from Mr. Eugene May. The documents presented by the plaintiff are mere copies lacking legal validity, and these accusations are entirely fabricated to tarnish the reputation of a respected family." My blood boiled. He was lying smooth as a snake. I couldn't stay silent. Despite Stephen's signal to stay calm, I stood. "Your Honor," I said, my voice trembling but resolute, "my grandfather, Eugene May, was a meticulous man. He didn't trust Mr. Pierce, which is why he entrusted a copy of his will to a military comrade. Mr. Pierce is lying, and I have evidence to prove it." The courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to me, and the tension felt like a taut string about to snap. My father glared at me, his eyes cold, but I didn't look away. Stephen continued, presenting Jack Sheridan's financial report. He highlighted 2 large cash withdrawals from my father's account, $50,000 right after my grandfather's death, and $30,000 2 months later. These sums, Stephen said sharply, align with the time the original will disappeared and when Mr. Connor Marshall, a friend of Eugene May, was pursued by hired thugs. Furthermore, emails provided by a reliable source show discussions between Mr. Harvey May and Mr. Norman Pierce about payments and handling it permanently. I watched Norman Pierce as Stephen spoke. His face remained composed, but I saw beads of sweat forming on his forehead, and his hands began to tremble slightly. My father, seated beside him, gripped the armrests of his chair, his eyes burning into me. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew I was on the right path. Then came the pivotal moment. Stephen requested to call a surprise witness, Connor Marshall. When Connor entered the courtroom, my heart raced. He looked older, more weary, but his eyes were as sharp as the first time we met. He took the oath, his voice low and steady. "I am Connor Marshall, a comrade of Eugene May from our military days," he began. Before he passed, Eugene entrusted me with a copy of his will and a message. "If anything happens, make sure it gets to Archer." He didn't trust his lawyer, Mr. Norman Pierce, and he feared the original will would be destroyed. I kept that copy, and I was hunted by hired men who tried to destroy it. Connor's testimony was like a bomb detonating in the courtroom. The room remained silent, but I felt a shift in the air. My father lowered his head, and for the first time I saw his usual confidence waver. Norman Pierce began muttering, trying to interrupt, but the judge signaled for him to be quiet. Stephen pressed on, playing my grandfather's recording. His voice echoed through the courtroom, frail but resolute. "I don't trust Norman Pierce, and I fear my son will do whatever it takes to take May and Sons." Those words, combined with Connor's testimony, left my father's side with little room to argue. Under the judge's pressure and Stephen's sharp questioning, Norman Pierce began to falter. He claimed he couldn't recall details of his meetings with my father, then contradicted himself by saying my father only visited for casual conversations. Stephen seized the opportunity, pointing out the inconsistencies in Pierce's testimony and emphasizing that the large cash withdrawals couldn't be coincidental. Finally, the judge struck her gavel. "Based on the evidence presented," she said sternly, "the court orders a separate criminal investigation into Mr. Norman Pierce and Mr. Harvey May for potential fraud and concealment of documents. The inheritance case will be reviewed again once the investigation is complete." I sat there, feeling as if a massive weight had been lifted. Stephen patted my shoulder, whispering, "We did it, Archer. But this isn't over yet." I nodded, my eyes still fixed on my father. He stood and left the courtroom without looking at me, but I knew he was shaken. For the first time, I felt I had the upper hand. In the days following the court hearing, Denver suddenly felt suffocating. News of the lawsuit spread like wildfire. Local newspapers, which had once praised my father as a successful businessman, now ran sensational headlines. "Inheritance scandal at May and Sons, allegations of fraud and will concealment." The articles didn't name me directly, but everyone knew I was behind the lawsuit. I received messages from old acquaintances, some supportive, others scornful, but I paid them no mind. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation ordered by the court began to unfold. Investigators from the district attorney's office contacted Stephen, requesting additional information. Stephen worked tirelessly, coordinating with them to ensure every detail was thoroughly examined. "They're digging deep into your father's accounts," Stephen told me during a meeting at his office. "If they find any transactions linked to Norman Pierce or the hired thugs, he won't be able to deny it." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the unease in my heart. My father wasn't someone who could be easily defeated. He had money, connections, and I knew he'd find a way to turn the tables. But what surprised me most was Brandon's silence. Since the night he handed me the emails at Rusty Nail, I hadn't heard from him. I texted and called, but there was no response. Part of me worried he'd changed his mind, that he'd sided with our father again. Yet another part held on to hope that Brandon, despite his past arrogance and selfishness, was genuinely trying to make amends. A few days later, I received a text from him. It was brief. Meet me at the park, 7 p.m. I hesitated but ultimately went, carrying the wariness that had become second nature. When I arrived at the park, Brandon was sitting on a bench, looking thinner and more exhausted than before. He stood when he saw me, his eyes filled with remorse. "Archer," he said, his voice hoarse. "I heard about the prosecution. I don't know what to say. I just want you to know you're doing the right thing this time." I looked at him. "You helped me, Brandon," I said. "But why did you disappear?" "I thought you'd gone back to Dad's side." Brandon shook his head, his eyes glistening with tears. "I was scared, Archer. Scared Dad would find out I gave you those emails. But I can't let him keep doing this. I don't want to be part of it anymore." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I know you don't trust me, but I want to make this right. If you need me to testify in court, I'll do it." I didn't respond immediately. I looked at Brandon and saw a younger brother I thought I'd lost. "Thank you, Brandon," I finally said. "You did the right thing, and I won't forget that." The criminal trial took place a few weeks later. My father and Norman Pierce were charged with fraud, concealment of documents, and conspiracy to commit a crime. Brandon, true to his word, testified, stating that he had overheard our father discussing with Pierce the plan to hide the will and hire men to intimidate Connor. His testimony, combined with the financial evidence and Connor's account, was the final blow. My father was sentenced to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole if he cooperated. Norman Pierce received a harsher sentence, 5 years for his central role in concealing the will. The inheritance case was reopened shortly after. With the original will recognized based on the copy and supporting evidence, I was granted ownership of May and Sons, as per my grandfather's wishes. I returned to the company, but not as CEO as before. Instead, I chose to take on the role of chairman. Brandon was not prosecuted thanks to his cooperation as a witness. I brought him back to the company, but in a minor role where he could learn and prove himself. I hadn't fully forgiven him, but I wanted to give him a chance, as my grandfather had taught me to believe in people's capacity to change. In the weeks following the criminal trial, Denver seemed to take on a different hue. The autumn sunlight was softer, but the air remained heavy with the lingering echoes of the lawsuit. My father, Harvey May, was now a name synonymous with scandal. Newspapers relentlessly covered the case, exposing the dark underbelly of a man once regarded as a pillar of the business community. The powerful connections he had once boasted about turned their backs, leaving him to face the consequences alone. The image of the empire of May and Sons, which my father had tried to build on deceit, was now nothing more than a stain in the eyes of the public. I returned to May and Sons as chairman, not to gloat over my victory, but to repair what had been broken. The company had suffered significant losses in the wake of the scandal. Many partners pulled out, veteran employees resigned, and the company's stock plummeted. But I wasn't discouraged. I remembered my grandfather's words. A sturdy building must be built on a foundation of fairness. I began restructuring, hiring new managers, focusing on transparency and quality. I met with each employee, listened to their concerns, and promised that May and Sons would rise again, not as a money-making machine, but as a legacy of honor and responsibility. One evening, after a long day of work, I walked through the May and Sons headquarters. The building was still under repair, its cracked walls a reminder of what we had endured. I paused before my grandfather's portrait hanging in the main lobby, his eyes as sharp and warm as ever. I recalled his words echoing through the years. In business, honor is worth more than money. I smiled, feeling as if he were standing beside me, patting my shoulder as he had done when I steered the company through a tough deal. I thought about my father now in prison and wondered if he ever felt regret. He had chosen money and power, but in the end, they couldn't save him. I thought about Brandon, how he was trying to start over. I stepped outside, standing under Denver's night sky. The city glowed with lights, each one like a story, a dream, a struggle. I didn't know what the future held, It might take years for May and Sons to recover, and I would face countless challenges. But I wasn't afraid. I had walked through darkness, faced betrayal from my own family, and I was still standing, stronger than ever. I looked up at the sky, where stars twinkled faintly amidst the city lights. I thought of my grandfather, of what he had left behind. Not just a company, but a lesson about life. This journey wasn't just about reclaiming a legacy. It was about protecting the truth, upholding honor, and giving others a chance to make amends. I knew that though he was no longer here, he would be proud that I hadn't given up. I took a deep breath, feeling Denver's cold air fill my chest. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I was certain of one thing. I would keep moving forward, carrying my grandfather's teachings, the flame of justice and truth. And in the twinkling lights of the city, I felt a strange peace, as if my grandfather were smiling somewhere among the stars.